Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Parenting Lab. Have you ever noticed that there's a kind of closeness that only seems to show up in crisis? It's the late night phone call from a friend, the midnight conversations with your teenager, the blow up that ends in tears and relief, maybe the moment when everything is falling apart and suddenly you feel needed again. And if you're honest, those moments can feel intimate. Like this is when the relationship really feels alive. But then the problem passes and things calm down, the intensity fades, and instead of relief, there's this strange emptiness, distance. Sometimes it's even an anxiety, because if there's not something wrong, or some huge problem to solve, or conversation to rehash, or common enemy, what's left? What do you talk about? What do you have in common? If you've ever felt closer to someone in pain than you do in peace, this episode is going to be for you. Because today we're talking about trauma bonding. And I want to be really clear right from the start. This is not about blame and it's not about weakness. Trauma bonding isn't about being dramatic or too attached. It's about what happens when our nervous system learns that connection comes through intensity, not safety. Or even one level deeper than that, that intensity is safety. I think a lot of what we hear about trauma bonding comes in the context of romantic relationships, like why do people stay when things are unhealthy? Or why is it so hard to walk away from relationships that are, from the outside, dysfunctional or damaging or even abusive? But trauma bonding in any relationship is really about stress-based connection. So that's the perspective I want to focus on here. Trauma bonding doesn't start in adulthood or even in partnerships. It often begins in families and friendships. It can show up between parents and children, between siblings, between adult children and their parents, and it can quietly shape the way we relate to everyone we love, especially when love has been mixed with fear, unpredictability, or emotional pain. For some of us, the deepest moments of connection happen during conflict or crisis. So our bodies learn something very specific, and that's that pain means closeness, that intensity means love, and on the flip side, that calm might actually mean disconnection. And here's the part that can feel a little bit unsettling to hear, but it's also where the breakthroughs happen, so listen closely. Sometimes what we call closeness isn't actually safety, it's familiarity. So in this episode, we're going to unpack what trauma bonding really is, how it forms, and how it can show up in our parenting, especially as our kids get older, but also in our friendships and our partnerships and our family relationships. We'll talk about why calm can feel uncomfortable, why distance can feel threatening, and why healing doesn't necessarily mean cutting people off. It often means learning how to stay connected without the pain being the glue. Now, this can be a sensitive thing for people. So if as we talk today, you're confronted with some of these realities, maybe for the first time, it's okay to feel dysregulated, upset, maybe even fearful of the fact that your relationships might be different than you thought. That awareness is not an accusation. It's an invitation to understand and move forward with intention, okay? So let's begin by slowing this down and defining what we're really talking about, because trauma bonding is one of those terms that gets used a lot and often in a way that feels either shaming or oversimplified. When I'm talking about trauma bonding today, I'm not talking about abuse. I'm not talking about intentional harm. I'm not talking about power or control or someone deliberately hurting someone else. Okay, what I am talking about is what happens when connection is built under chronic stress. Stress in the family system, stress in a friendship or a relationship, stress in a nervous system that had to stay alert, responsive, or emotionally engaged in order to stay connected. Trauma bonding in this context isn't about cruelty. It's about attachment that forms while the body is under pressure. Now, for many people, connection didn't happen in long stretches of calm. It happened during emotional moments, high conflict or overwhelm, during moments of great need or urgency, distress. So the nervous system learns something very specific, not usually consciously, but this becomes physical. And that's that connection happens when something is wrong. It doesn't mean someone was trying to cause pain. It just means that closeness was most available during those moments of intensity. And over time, our body starts to associate emotional activation with intimacy, high engagement with love, and being needed with that sense of belonging. Now, this is subtle. And it's incredibly common in families, especially in families where there's a lot of responsibility early on, or there were high emotions, where caregivers were maybe overwhelmed or stretched thin or inconsistent. Not because they didn't care that there wasn't love, but because life is just busy and hard. Nothing here is requiring abuse to be present. Okay, so notice the distinction there. In fact, many people who experience trauma bonding often say, "My parents loved me. We were close. We showed up for each other." These are common responses, and all of that can be true. The missing piece here isn't love, it's regulation. When connection happens primarily in moments of stress, the nervous system doesn't learn how to feel close and calm at the same time. So later, whether it's in friendships or romantic relationships, even our parenting, that sense of calm can actually feel strangely empty. Not that it's wrong, it's just unfamiliar. And once we understand trauma bonding this way, we can talk about it without the blame, without the labels, and without turning this into a story about abuse. We can talk about it as a pattern of connection that's shaped by nervous system learning, one that can absolutely be softened and healed. And this is where it becomes especially relevant for families, because these patterns don't stop when children grow up. In fact, they often evolve. When we talk about stress-based bonding in families, we're not looking for something or someone to blame. What we're really looking at are conditions, because attachment doesn't form in a vacuum. It forms inside real lives where real stressors are actively happening all the time, and real nervous systems are doing their best to keep up with what's going on. For many families, connection happened in moments of urgency, when someone's overwhelmed or emotions are high. It can be when there was something to soothe or fix or manage, not because calm wasn't valued, but because calm wasn't always available. So the moments of togetherness were often moments of intensity. When we zoom out and look at this through a nervous system lens, something important starts to become clear, and that's that connection forms in the conditions that are most consistent. For many people, these conditions included stress, not necessarily harm or abuse, just nervous systems operating under pressure, right? When life requires a lot of emotional engagement, responding, adjusting, managing, attuning, the body learns that activation is part of a connection. So closeness doesn't get associated with stillness. It gets associated with movement, with intensity, with emotional charge. And over time, the nervous system starts to expect that rhythm. This isn't something we think our way into. It's something the body just learns through repetition. And that learning doesn't stay confined to our childhood. It follows us into how we connect and how we stay engaged and how we recognize emotional intimacy further on in our adulthood. Which means that for many of us, connection feels most familiar when there's something happening, something to respond to fix, to process, or to hold. When things slow down, there can be an unexpected sense of distance. Not because the bond is gone, but because the pace has changed. And this is where people often feel confused. As a coach, I hear things like, "Oh, now that this big thing is over, we don't have anything to talk about." Or, "Me and this other person don't have anything else in common but this big thing," right? They overshare or over-explain or over-invest in other people's problems. But what they're really saying underneath those behaviors is, "I don't feel as connected when things are calm," or "I feel closest when there's emotion or intensity or movement." And again, this isn't a sign that you crave chaos or that you're a drama seeker. It's a sign that your nervous system learned that connection is an activated state. Once we understand this, trauma bonding stops being a dramatic or a pathological idea and starts looking like just a human adaptation. It's a nervous system doing what it learned to do to stay connected to the people around it. And this brings us to an important question, one that applies to parenting and partnerships and friendships, and even our relationship with ourselves. And that is, what happens when the intensity fades? Because for many people, calm isn't neutral. It's unfamiliar. It's uncomfortable. That unfamiliarity can create discomfort and restlessness, or a subtle sense of disconnection, even when nothing is actually wrong. Once a nervous system learns connection through activation, calm feels strange. Not bad or wrong, just unfamiliar. And this is one of the most misunderstood parts of healing because we tend to assume that safety should automatically feel good and that calm should feel like relief, that stability should feel grounding. But for many people, calm doesn't register as safety right away. It registers as nothing happening. And a nervous system that learned to stay engaged and responsive or on alert can interpret that absence of stimulation as disconnection or even as danger. So instead of relaxing, the body is constantly scanning. It's waiting. It's looking for something to respond to. This is why calm can sometimes feel boring, empty, or even that subtle discomfort. Not because you need chaos, but because your system hasn't practiced stillness as a place of connection. It's also why intensity can feel meaningful. High emotion creates sensation, creates movement, it creates a sense of being in the relationship and active. Calm requires something different. It requires the nervous system to trust that connection can exist without effort, urgency, or activation. And that is a skill, not a personality trait, not a moral achievement, a skill that has to be learned slowly. This shows up in all kinds of relationships. Anytime connection has been defined by engagement or activation rather than ease, stillness can feel like a loss of signal, like the wires aren't touching anymore and the power just isn't flowing. And that can create a quiet urge to do something, say something, process something, stir something up. Not consciously, not intentionally, just as a way to feel connected again. Understanding this is important because without it, people often judge themselves really harshly. They'll think things like, oh, why can't I just enjoy when things are okay? Or why do I feel disconnected when nothing is wrong? Or why do I feel more alive in emotional or difficult moments than I do in those quiet, peaceful ones? Of course, calm feels unfamiliar if it wasn't the environment where connection lived. Now, the good news is that the nervous system is adaptable, which means calm can become a place of connection, but it usually takes time and repetition and awareness. And to get there, it helps to understand the different ways that we define closeness, because not all connection is the same. Connection can be regulating, it can be all consuming, and sometimes it can feel intimate in the moment, but then leave us feeling depleted later. So a simple distinction here becomes really useful. Sometimes having the right language, right? We talk about language. That language helps things click in a new way. So when we talk about connection, we're often using one word to describe very different experiences, and those differences matter. So let's give this concept of connection some clearer definitions, okay? First, secure attachment is connection without fear. There's closeness, but there's also space. You don't have to monitor the relationship constantly to feel secure in it. You can disagree, take a break, grow, change, and the bond doesn't collapse. Calm doesn't threaten it, and distance doesn't erase it. The second one here is enmeshment. Enmeshment is connection without boundaries. Closeness comes from staying emotionally intertwined. Roles blur. Separation can feel destabilizing, even when it's healthy separation. There's often a sense that connection is dependent on staying very involved in each other's inner worlds. Again, this isn't about bad intentions. Enmeshment often grows out of love, loyalty, or survival, but it can make it hard to feel connected and separate at the same time. I want to pause here for a second because I know that this one might be hitting home for some of you. I want you to notice what's coming up for you right now. This is an incredibly common dynamic in families, especially for women. And hearing it described in these terms for the first time can feel like a lot to process. It's completely normal to feel a little overwhelmed by it, so take it slow as we're going through these definitions if you need to. The third type of connection then is trauma bonding. Trauma bonding is connection that requires pain or unpredictability or emotional injury to stay alive. The bond doesn't feel strongest in calm. It feels the strongest after a rupture or stress or intensity. Relief after conflict often feels like closeness, and reconnection after distress feels like intimacy. What makes this confusing is that trauma bonds can feel very deep. Bonded relationships often happen really fast, like friends who just meet and within days are inseparable, like you found a soulmate. that we just met, but I feel like I've known you forever feeling is actually your nervous system's recognizing a familiar level of intensity. There is care there, there is attachment there, but the line between the person and the experience is blurred because the nervous system hasn't learned how to experience connection without activation. And here's the question I want you to sit with here, not to answer it right away or to judge yourself, but just to notice what comes up when you think about it. If things were calm and predictable, if there was no crisis, if the trauma wound was healed and there was no chaos, would this relationship still feel meaningful to me? There's no right or wrong answer. This isn't about labeling your relationships or deciding what to do next or breaking up relationships or friendships. It has so much more to do with just being curious. Because the moment we can name the type of connection we're experiencing, we stop asking what's wrong with me and start asking a much more useful question. What has my nervous system learned about what connection feels like? Is it connection without fear? Connection without boundaries? Or connection based on shared stress and activation? Once we start to see these different forms of connection clearly, something else becomes easier to understand. And that's that these patterns don't just belong to individuals. They move through families. Not because anyone planned it that way, but because our brains and our nervous systems learn in relationship, and then we carry those lessons forward. What feels like love to one generation often becomes the template for the next one. And that means patterns of connection, whether they're secure or enmeshed or stress-based, tend to repeat until something interrupts them. Right now, we're living in a moment where a lot of people are choosing distance from their families, cutting relationships off, pulling way back, or creating a firm separation. And I'm not here to tell you whether that's right or wrong, but I do think it's important to understand why this is happening. For so many people, separation is the first time their nervous system has ever felt relief. Not because their families were intentionally harmful, but because the only available form of connection required too much emotional activation, too much vigilance, too much intensity, too much responsibility. So when someone finally creates that sense of distance, the nervous system just exhales, and that relief can feel like safety. This doesn't mean the bond was loveless or unhealthy. It just means it was too costly. And when the cost of staying connected feels higher than the pain of the separation, people choose distance, not as a form of rejection, but as a form of regulation. This is also why separation can feel so destabilizing for the people on the other side of it. If connection has always been maintained through closeness, involvement, or emotional engagement, then distance can feel like abandonment, even when no harm was intended. So if you end up with two nervous systems, they're experiencing the same rupture, but very differently. One feels relief, and the other feels loss. But both reactions make sense. What's important to understand here is that cutoff is often not the final goal, it's the protective strategy. It's a way of creating space when there hasn't yet been another way to stay connected without dysregulation. For some people, that distance remains permanent, and for others, it's temporary. And for some, it becomes the doorway to learning a new kind of relationship, one that can hold boundaries and connection. What we're really seeing in this cultural moment is not people abandoning family values. What we're seeing is nervous systems that are no longer willing to equate love with exhaustion. And that awareness, whether it leads to reconnection or not, is part of a larger shift towards understanding what sustainable connection actually requires. When we talk about healing stress-based or trauma-shaped bonds, I want to be very clear about something, and that's that healing doesn't have to mean pulling away. It doesn't have to mean becoming distant or abandoning the people that you love. Healing is about changing the conditions under which connection happens. So instead of connection requiring intensity, healing invites connection to exist in safety. And that is a practice. The first piece of healing is learning to notice what your body does in those moments of calm. When things slow down, do you feel restless, disconnected, uneasy? That moment right there is not a problem to fix. It's information. Healing starts when we stop interpreting that discomfort is something wrong in the relationship and start recognizing it as the nervous system adjusting to a new environment or our brains just rewiring to a new path. If we can notice the physical signs of discomfort, we can start to learn to identify the emotional signs that follow. The second practice in healing is building a tolerance for low intensity connection that doesn't involve processing or fixing or deep emotional exchange. It's just shared presence, neutral moments, ordinary interactions. These moments can feel insignificant, but they're actually reparative. They teach the nervous system connection can exist without urgency. One way of doing this is practicing having conversations where you don't focus on problems or gossip or drama or conflict. When we approach conversations with this kind of intention, we can see pretty quickly if we're seeking connection through trauma because we'll have a hard time finding other things to talk about. There are lots of other ways to build that tolerance, but conversation is a big one. The third piece of healing, then, is separating love from responsibility. This is especially important in parenting and caregiving relationships. Love does not have to mean managing someone else's emotions. Closeness doesn't mean constant availability. When responsibility loosens, connection often becomes more sustainable, not less. Now, there's one more layer here that ties in, and I want to name it really gently because it's tender for a lot of people that I work with, but also because it matters. And that is that for some parents, connection has been built through being needed, through showing up in hard moments, through carrying worry, through staying emotionally close when things are heavy. And over time, that role can quietly become part of our identity. This isn't always done maliciously or with hurtful intentions. It's really the embodiment of what happens when love and responsibility just get tangled together. So if your sense of worth has been shaped by caregiving or serving, by attunement, by being the steady presence in someone else's struggle, especially your child's, then separation or disruption to that system doesn't just feel like change. It feels like loss. And when children grow, when they need us less, when they pull away or create distance, it can stir up grief that's hard to name. Not because you want them to suffer or to be dependent on you, but because suffering and dependence was where connection lived. Because the nervous system learned this is where love shows up. If they don't need me, what does love even look like? And subconsciously, we find ways to be needed because we still crave that responsibility for that person's happiness and success and all those good things. So when healing begins, when relationships move toward calm and boundaries and independence, it can sometimes feel like abandonment, even when it's not, even when love is still there. And that grief deserves compassion because letting go of pain as proof of love doesn't mean letting go of the love itself. It means learning how to recognize it in a new way. That's what makes this one of the hardest practices in healing trauma bonds, that separation of love and responsibility. Another important part of healing is allowing boundaries to coexist with warmth. Boundaries aren't the opposite of love. They're often what make love possible without the exhaustion that comes with it. A relationship doesn't become less meaningful when it becomes more spacious. It often becomes more honest. And finally, healing trauma-shaped bonds means redefining intimacy, letting intimacy include calm and silence and trust that the bond isn't going to disappear if nothing is happening. Now you might be thinking, man, that sounds boring. I want passion. I want fire. And I'm not saying that calm equals still or robotic or monotone. Not at all. Peace is not the absence of passion. It's the absence of threat. You can have passionate conversations that aren't dysregulating. You can have fire and heat and debate and all of those things. What you don't have to have is pain. Now, this can feel subtle and slow, and honestly, sometimes it's anticlimactic. But over time, the nervous system learns a new truth, that connection doesn't have to hurt to be real, that closeness doesn't require sacrifice or hurt or extremes to be meaningful, and that love can feel steady without losing its depth. The reality is some of us didn't learn how to connect in calm. We learned how to connect in motion, in effort, in response. And that doesn't make us broken. It makes us adaptive. Trauma bonding and stress-based connection and enmeshment, these aren't moral failures. Their nervous system's doing what they learned to do to stay close, to draw people in and to feel like we belong, that we're part of something. Healing this type of connection doesn't ask you to erase your history. It's just asking you to update it, to let your body experience connection without that sense of urgency, to notice when calm is feeling unfamiliar and to stay in that unfamiliarity anyway, to allow love to feel steadier, even if that steadiness feels quiet or even unproductive at first. If you find yourself grieving the intensity, that's okay. If you miss being needed, that's okay. And if part of you wonders who you are when you're not managing or fixing or holding everything together, that's okay too. Change can feel like loss before it feels like freedom. But connection doesn't disappear when pain is no longer the glue that holds it all together. It just changes. And with time, the nervous system can learn that love can be present without effort and that closeness doesn't have to cost you your peace. If there's one thing I hope you take from this episode, it's this. You don't have to suffer to stay connected. You're allowed to want relationships that feel safe and spacious and sustainable, whether you're parenting or partnering or simply learning how to be with the people you love in a new way. If nothing else, I hope you'll leave with a new awareness of how you connect with others and maybe bring a little more intention into your conversations and your relationships and your expectations. Thank you so much for being here. I can't wait to see you all next week, where we'll continue to explore the art and science of parenting and put your parenting to the test. Take care, everyone.